They say wolves are ruthless predators, but what if I told you one wolf did something so unbelievable? It would change everything you think about these wild creatures. A devastating car crash, a helpless baby, and a predator lurking in the shadows. But instead of a tragic ending, what happened next will give you chills. Stay with me, because this story is nothing like you'd expect. It was a cold, moonlit night when a tragic accident turned a quiet road into a scene of destruction. A car flipped on its side, smoke rising from the wreckage. Inside, a baby alive, but alone. But fate had something else in store. Out of the darkness, a lone wolf appeared. A predator, drawn to the scent of vulnerability. Was it looking for an easy meal? What happened next defied every law of nature. This is the unbelievable story of survival, instinct, and something that can only be described as a miracle. The road stretched endlessly through the wilderness, winding between towering trees that swayed under the weight of the cold night air. It was a route few traveled after sunset, too remote, too isolated, too easy to disappear without a trace. On this fateful night, the moon hung high, its silver glow barely piercing the thick canopy above. The only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves, the whisper of the wind weaving through the trees. But then, out of nowhere, came the deafening screech of tires. A single set of headlights sliced through the darkness. Erratic, desperate, the car veered violently, skidding on the icy road. The driver fought for control, but it was too late. A sharp curve, a loss of traction, the sickening crunch of metal twisting upon impact. Then silence. The car lay on its side, half crushed against the thick trunk of a fallen tree. Steam hissed from the engine, rising into the frigid air like a ghostly mist. The windshield was shattered, fragments of glass glittering under the moonlight, like tiny stars scattered across the forest floor. Inside the wreckage, there was no movement, no sound, just the eerie stillness of a scene frozen in time. But then a faint rustling. A tiny, shuddering breath. The baby, swaddled in the back seat, barely a few months old. The child stirred. A soft whimper escaped its lips, a weak, fragile sound swallowed instantly by the vast emptiness around it. No one heard. No one was coming. The parents lay motionless in the front seats. Blood streaked the dashboard, a silent testament to the violence of the crash. They didn't stir, didn't groan, didn't call for help. The baby was alone. And the cold was creeping in. The forest wasn't a forgiving place. Temperatures had plummeted well below freezing, and without the car's heater running, the air inside the wreckage turned frigid. The baby's breath came out in tiny puffs of mist, its little fingers twitching, curling instinctively into its blanket for warmth. It wouldn't last long. Hypothermia was a silent killer, especially for something so small, so fragile. It would start with shivering, tiny tremors that the baby wouldn't even understand. Then, the body would slow down, conserving energy, withdrawing warmth from extremities. If no help arrived, the cold would take over completely. Hour after hour passed, no headlights in the distance, no voices calling through the night, just the whisper of the wind. And then something changed. A shift in the air, a presence, something watching. A shadow moved between the trees, almost soundless. Only the faintest crunch of snow betrayed its approach. A wolf, but not just any wolf. This one was massive. Its coat was thick, layered with years of survival in the unforgiving wilderness. Its golden eyes pierced through the darkness, reflecting the moonlight like twin lanterns. It had caught the scent long before it arrived. Something unfamiliar, something human. The wolf lowered its head, ears flicking forward, muscles tensed as it prowled closer to the wreckage. It wasn't alone. Far behind, hidden in the dense underbrush, other eyes flickered. The pack was near, waiting, watching. But this wolf was the first to step forward. Predators were drawn to weakness, to vulnerability, to prey. And inside that wreckage, lying helpless and exposed, was the most defenseless creature of all. A human baby, alone, small, fragile. The wolf inched closer. Steam curled from its nostrils, a soft huff in the freezing air. Its ears twitched as it listened, its sharp nose testing the scent. Blood, metal, and warmth. Faint but there. The baby whimpered again, shifting weakly in its blanket. It was barely conscious now, the cold pressing in, numbing its tiny limbs. The wolf's muscles coiled, instinct roaring in its veins. A human child, an easy target, a meal. But then something shifted, something unexpected. The wolf hesitated. It should have attacked. Any other predator would have. A cub this small, abandoned, alone in the dead of winter? It was an invitation for nature to take its course. But this wolf didn't lunge. It didn't snarl. It didn't kill. Instead, it lowered its head. It stepped forward, cautiously, carefully, sniffing the baby's tiny fingers. There was something wrong here, something unnatural. This wasn't prey. This wasn't a meal. It was something else. A responsibility, a call buried deep within instincts older than time itself. The wolf's ears flicked back, golden eyes narrowing as it made a decision no wild predator should ever make. It opened its mouth, but not to bite, gently, with the precision of a creature far more intelligent than it had any right to be. The wolf closed its powerful jaws around the baby's blanket, and then, in one fluid motion, it lifted the child, not to harm, but to carry. The wolf turned away from the wreckage, its massive paws barely making a sound as it moved into the trees. The baby, cradled carefully in its grip, didn't cry, didn't fight, didn't even wake. It had been chosen, and the forest had just rewritten its own rules. The journey through the wilderness was long, relentless. The wolf moved swiftly, yet cautiously, dodging fallen branches and patches of deep snow. It wasn't alone anymore. Behind it, the rest of the pack followed, silent shadows in the night. They didn't attack the strange bundle their leader carried. They didn't challenge its decision. They simply followed. An understanding had settled over them, an unspoken law stronger than instinct itself. This child, this tiny human, did not belong to the cold. It belonged to them now. Hours passed. The deeper they traveled, the warmer it became, until finally the den, a hidden place, tucked away in the heart of the forest. The pack formed a loose circle, their eyes glowing in the dim moonlight. The alpha, the wolf that had saved the child, lowered its head and gently placed the baby on a bed of dry leaves and fur. Then, something remarkable happened. A female wolf stepped forward. A mother, her own pups, only weeks old, huddled beside her. She sniffed the child, her nose pressing against its tiny chest. And then, without hesitation, she curled around it, protecting it, keeping it warm. The baby shifted slightly, its tiny fingers brushing against the wolf's thick fur. And for the first time since the accident, it slept peacefully. This is where survival should have been impossible. This is where nature should have been merciless. But instead, something unexplainable had happened. The baby had been abandoned by the world of humans and adopted by the wild. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the distant cries of unseen creatures in the night. The world remained frozen, indifferent to the fate of the tiny human now cradled in the jaws of a predator. But this was not an attack. The wolf, massive, powerful, built for the hunt, moved with a carefulness that defied nature itself. Its grip was firm yet gentle, ensuring the baby remained unharmed as it carried it through the dense undergrowth. The child, still wrapped in a tattered blanket, stirred faintly, too weak to react, too cold to cry. The forest swallowed them whole, the wreckage of the car growing smaller in the distance, fading into the abyss of the forgotten. Deeper and deeper they went, where no human foot had stepped in years. And somewhere within the heart of this ancient wilderness, hidden beneath the tangled roots and shadows of towering trees, was the den, a sanctuary, a home. The wolf's arrival did not go unnoticed. Within the den, other golden eyes flickered open, ears twitching at the sound of approaching footsteps. The pack, silent, disciplined, watched their leader return, their breath visible in the crisp night air. But something was different. He was carrying something human. The wolves rose to their feet, muscles tensed, their noses twitching as they caught the unfamiliar scent. A human child, an outsider, a threat. For a moment, the den was filled with uncertainty. Wolves did not take in humans. Wolves were not meant to care. Yet, there their alpha stood, unmoving, unwavering, his powerful frame silhouetted against the dim moonlight, the child still safely in his jaws. And then, slowly, he lowered the baby onto a bed of dried leaves and fur. A moment of stillness, then curiosity. The pack inched forward, noses reaching, sniffing cautiously at the bundle. Their breath warmed the child's fragile skin, their ears flicking as they listened to its faint, rhythmic breathing. Not a single snarl, not a single growl. They should have rejected it, but they didn't. Instead, they accepted it. And then, something even more extraordinary happened. From the depths of the den, a female wolf stepped forward. Her coat was thick, silvered by age, yet her eyes burned with the fierce protectiveness of a mother. Beside her, her own pups, only weeks old, stirred in their sleep, their tiny bodies curled together in warmth. She had nursed them, protected them, given them life, and now she was staring at a different child, a strange child, a human child. The pack waited, silent, watching. She lowered her head, her black nose brushing against the baby's fragile cheek. The child whimpered softly, shifting under the sudden warmth of the wolf's breath. And then, in one final act of instinctive decision, she curled around it, her body wrapped around the child, shielding it from the cold. She licked its tiny face, just as she did with her own pups, cleaning away the dirt, warming its fragile skin. The pack did not interfere. They simply watched as one of their own, a mother, did what came naturally. She had accepted the child, and in that moment, the pack had accepted it too. The cold was relentless. Had the child remained in the wreckage, alone, abandoned, it would have perished before dawn. But here, inside the den, it was safe. The warmth of the mother wolf's body replaced what had been lost to the freezing night. The soft fur cushioned the baby's fragile skin, preventing hypothermia from claiming its tiny life. The other pups stirred, their small bodies pressing against the strange newcomer. To them, it was simply another warm thing to curl beside. They did not care for differences. They only knew family. Outside, the alpha stood guard. His golden eyes scanned the darkened forest, ears flicking at every distant rustle. He remained vigilant, his body poised, ready to defend the den at all costs. This child, this human, it belonged to them now. Time passed, the night deepened, and slowly, the forest began to change. The silence was broken by the distant call of a bird. Then another. The world was waking. A sliver of golden light pierced through the treetops, chasing away the darkness. The wolves stirred, stretching their powerful limbs, shaking the frost from their thick coats. And then, there was a sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable, the sound of humans. Somewhere beyond the trees, search dogs barked. Men called out, their voices cutting through the morning air. The wreckage had been found. They were looking, hunting, searching for the child that had disappeared in the night. The alpha wolf stood at the mouth of the den, his ears pricked forward, his sharp eyes narrowing at the sounds of approaching humans. He knew what this meant. The world had come to reclaim what it had lost. The pack gathered behind him, watching, waiting. The mother wolf tightened her grip around the baby, a low whimper escaping her throat. She knew what was coming. She had protected this tiny creature through the coldest night. She had warmed it, comforted it, given it a place among her own. But now she would have to let go. The world had found its lost child, and the pack would fade back into the shadows, where they belonged. The baby shifted. A tiny, weak sound escaped its lips, a soft whimper, no louder than a whisper. The mother wolf lowered her head, nudging it one last time. One last touch, one last act of love. The alpha let out a low, rumbling growl, not of warning, but of finality. It was time, and as the first figure broke through the trees, calling out in a frantic voice, the wolves disappeared, silent, unseen, leaving behind only a miracle, a baby, alive, saved by the very creatures it should have feared. The morning light crept slowly across the dense forest, touching the frost-covered branches, casting long shadows on the frozen ground. The air was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that carried secrets, and somewhere, hidden within the vast, untamed wilderness, a miracle was waiting to be found. The rescue team had been out all night. Flashlights cut through the darkness, casting long, trembling beams over the forest floor. Their boots crunched against frozen leaves, their breaths visible in the bitter cold. They had searched the roads, the ditches, every possible place where the baby could have been thrown from the crash. Nothing. By morning, hope was beginning to fade. Then they found it. The wreckage, an overturned car, crumpled metal, shattered glass, empty. The rescuers exchanged uneasy glances. The child wasn't here. That meant only one thing. It was out there, alone, lost in the wild. And if the cold hadn't already taken it, something else would. A bear, a mountain lion, even a pack of wolves. They had seen it before. Nature didn't forgive weakness. The clock was running out. Then, a sound, a distant, echoing howl, low, haunting, coming from deep within the trees. The rescuers froze. Wolves, the leader of the search party, an experienced tracker, raised a hand. Did you hear that? Everyone nodded, and without another word, they followed the sound. The forest grew darker as they moved deeper inside. The morning sun barely reached through the thick canopy. Every step felt heavier. Every sound was magnified. The snap of a twig, the distant caw of a raven, the rhythmic crunch of their boots. Then, they saw them, a pack of wolves, standing in a clearing, their bodies tense, their golden eyes locked onto the approaching humans. The rescuers stopped in their tracks. It was a sight they had never expected. A full pack, watching, waiting. For a moment, no one breathed. Wolves were unpredictable, and they had never been known to give up their prey without a fight. One of the men reached for his rifle, his fingers trembling against the cold metal. But before he could raise it, someone gasped, and there, nestled in the center of the pack, lying on a bed of soft leaves and fur, was the baby. No one moved. No one spoke. The child was alive, warm, safe, surrounded by wolves. The rescuers couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. The very creatures they had feared, the predators they had assumed would be the greatest danger, had done the impossible. They had protected the child. A deep, primal instinct had overridden nature itself. This pack had accepted the baby as their own, but the wolves were still watching, still waiting. Would they allow the humans to take the child, or had the baby become one of them? Then, the mother wolf stepped forward. Her fur shimmered in the morning light. Her eyes locked onto the search party. She was not afraid. She was not aggressive. She was waiting. Her powerful body stood over the child, her stance firm, but not threatening. She did not snarl, did not bare her teeth. She simply looked at them. And then, something remarkable happened. She lowered her head. Her black nose brushed against the baby one last time. A soft whimper escaped her throat. It was not a sound of hostility. It was a sound of goodbye. The rescuers felt something shift in the air. The wolves were not going to fight. The mother wolf had made her choice. She was letting go. Slowly, cautiously, one of the rescuers stepped forward. The wolves did not move. The mother wolf's ears flicked, but she held her ground. The rescuer knelt, his hands trembling as he reached toward the baby. Still, the wolves did nothing. They simply watched. And when the rescuer's fingers finally touched the child's tiny body, lifting it gently into his arms, the pack stepped back. Not a single growl, not a single sign of resistance. They simply backed away. And then, just as silently as they had appeared, they turned and vanished into the trees, one by one, disappearing into the wilderness, until only one remained. The mother. She lingered for a moment, her golden eyes locking onto the child one last time. The baby, still weak, opened its eyes, and in that single second, something unspoken passed between them, something neither human nor animal could ever explain. Then, without a sound, the mother wolf turned, and she was gone. The rescuers stood there, frozen in place, the baby cradled in their arms. For a long time, no one spoke, because what could they say? How do you explain something that defies nature? How do you put into words the impossible? A pack of wolves had saved a human child, not harmed it, not abandoned it, but protected it. For one night, in the heart of the wilderness, nature had rewritten its own rules, and no one would ever understand why. The baby let out a tiny sigh, shifting in the rescuer's arms. The wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere, deep within the unseen depths of the forest, a single howl echoed, soft, faint, a farewell, and a reminder that sometimes the wild is not as cruel as we think. Sometimes it is kinder than we deserve. The baby was rushed to the hospital, bundled tightly in warm blankets, its tiny body cradled in the arms of a paramedic. The ambulance tore through the morning fog, red lights flashing against the pale sky. Inside, a nurse checked the child's pulse, her fingers shaking as she pressed against the baby's soft skin. Warm, still warm. Her eyes darted to the paramedic beside her. "This doesn't make sense," he nodded, his grip tightening on the edge of the stretcher. "I know, because it didn't make sense. A baby, left alone in the freezing wilderness for an entire night, should not have survived. But somehow, against all logic, this one had." The hospital was already prepared when the ambulance arrived. A team of doctors and nurses flooded the entrance, their faces a mixture of concern and disbelief. The baby was placed on a small hospital bed, wires gently attached to its chest, a warm foreline inserted into its delicate arm. Everyone held their breath. Then, a slow, steady beep. Then another, and another. The baby's heart was strong. A miracle. One of the doctors, an older man with years of experience in pediatric emergencies, leaned over, checking the child's tiny limbs. No frostbite, no bruises, not even a scratch. He exhaled, shaking his head. Impossible. Another doctor, a woman in her 40s, studied the child's body temperature on the monitor. Perfectly normal. No hypothermia. No signs of prolonged exposure to the cold. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. There's no way this baby survived a night in the wild without something. That's when one of them noticed it, the scent. She leaned in, breathing softly against the child's tiny shirt. Her eyes widened. Pine, earth, fur, the unmistakable scent of the forest, of wolves. She looked up, whispering. This baby was with them. No one knew what to say, because the thought was unbelievable. By now, news of the incident had spread beyond the hospital walls. Reporters gathered outside, cameras flashing. Microphones shoved forward as doctors tried to piece together what had happened. How did the baby survive? Was it really raised by wolves for a night? Did the wolves protect it? Or were they simply waiting to? No one had an answer, because the truth was, no one really knew. In nature, wolves are apex predators. They hunt, they survive, they do not nurture human children. And yet, this pack had done just that. So why? What force had driven them to protect instead of prey? Theories swirled. Some scientists claimed it was a case of misdirected maternal instinct, that the mother wolf, still nursing her own pups, had simply responded to the sound of an infant's cry. Others believed it was territorial behavior, that the wolves had hidden the child in their den not out of kindness, but to keep it from other predators. Then there were those who thought it was something deeper, something beyond logic, something primal. Perhaps, for one night, the laws of nature had bent. Perhaps, in that freezing darkness, something ancient had stirred, a bond older than civilization itself, a moment where two species, separated by thousands of years, had found an understanding in the most unexpected way. Whatever the reason, one thing was certain. This baby had not just survived, it had been protected. Days passed, the child grew stronger, its tiny fingers curling around the hands of doctors and nurses who visited the crib. But something was different. Every night, when the hospital quieted, when the halls were empty, and the world outside stood still, the baby would stir, turn its head, and let out a soft, almost imperceptible whimper, a crying out of hunger, not of fear, but of something else, something no one could understand, as if, even in the warmth of a hospital room, it missed the cold embrace of the forest, as if, even now, it could still feel the presence of the mother wolf, and maybe, just maybe, she could still feel the child, too. The search team had long since left the forest. The wrecked car had been towed away. The baby was safe, but deep within the trees, where human footprints faded and the wilderness reclaimed its own, the pack remained. And on a quiet night, under the glow of the full moon, a single wolf stood atop a rocky ledge, her golden eyes fixed on the distant lights of the town below. She was alone now, but she remembered. She remembered the warmth of the child in her den, the soft rise and fall of its breathing, the way it had nuzzled closer, trusting her completely. And though it was gone, a piece of it remained with her. She lifted her head to the sky, and then, a howl, low, haunting, a sound that carried through the trees, through the mountains, through the world itself, a sound that said, "I remember you." And somewhere in a hospital crib, a baby shifted in its sleep, a tiny hand curled, a breath hitched, and though it would never remember, though it would never know, a connection had been made, one that would never truly break. No one knows what truly happened that night. There were no cameras, no witnesses, no evidence beyond what was left behind. A wrecked car, a missing baby, a pack of wolves that should have done what nature demanded, but didn't. What makes a predator choose compassion? What force bends the laws of the wild? Perhaps we'll never know, but maybe, just maybe, not all miracles come from heaven. Some are born in the heart of the wilderness. And sometimes, when the world least expects it, nature becomes the protector we never knew we had. If this story gave you chills, hit subscribe for more unbelievable animal stories.